The water was warm that night in Las Vegas, steam rising under stage lights like something holy. Lili St. reclined in the bathtub. Real water, real porcelain, nothing simulated, moving with the deliberate grace of someone performing ritual rather than spectacle. The audience sat mesmerized, watching her soap her shoulders, rinse her arms, exist in her own pleasure as if they weren't there at all. This was the genius of it. She never performed for them. She performed for herself, and they were permitted to witness. Then the doors burst open. Police, flashbulbs, the crash of institutional morality interrupting art. Lili didn't flinch. She stood, water streaming down her body, and looked directly at the photographers now crowding the stage. Her voice was steady, almost amused. "Tell them it's art. They won't believe you." Won't. They arrested her anyway. Handcuffed her in a silk robe, charged her with obscenity, made headlines across America. The photo from that night, Lili half-draped, defiant, gorgeous, became more famous than any performance. It captured everything about her. The refusal to apologize, the understanding that desire and dignity weren't opposites, the absolute certainty that her body belonged to her and no one else. "They handcuffed me for being clean," she'd say later, laughing. But the laugh had edges. She'd spent her career fighting this fight, the right to control her own image, her own narrative, her own power. Burlesque was her weapon, beauty her armor, intelligence her secret advantage. People thought they were watching a woman undress. They were actually watching a masterclass in autonomy. "I never stripped for men. I stripped for myself to see how power felt on skin." She grew up where dreams froze solid in Minnesota winters. Born Marie Van Schaack on June 3, 1918 in Minneapolis, she entered a world that had very specific ideas about what women should be. Modest, marriageable, content with small lives in cold rooms. Her family was middle class, respectable, the kind of people who went to church and didn't make scenes. Marie learned early that respectability was another word for confinement, that what people called propriety was just fear wearing nice clothes. Her first lesson wasn't how to please, it was how invisibility felt like death. She was beautiful, even young. The kind of beauty that made adults uncomfortable because it suggested power before she knew how to use it. But beauty in Minnesota in the 1920s meant marriage proposals, not possibilities. It meant being looked at but never listened to, desired but not autonomous. Marie felt the cage long before she could articulate it, the sense that her body and her future were things other people assumed they had rights to. At 15, she started dancing. Not professionally, just at parties, in her room, anywhere she could move and feel something besides the weight of expectation. Dancing was the first thing that felt like hers, where her body obeyed her instead of everyone else's rules. She was good at it, naturally graceful, but more importantly, she loved how it felt. The rare moments where she existed purely as movement rather than object. By 18, she'd fled Minnesota, first to California, then to Montreal, following the circuit of small clubs and cabarets where a girl with ambition and no connections could at least try. She worked as a chorus dancer, did swing numbers in clubs that smelled like cigarette smoke and broken dreams. It was hard, exhausting work for almost no money. But it was hers. Every step away from respectability felt like breathing. Could this early escape have planted the understanding that freedom always costs something? Montreal in the late 1930s was where Marie became Lili. The name change was strategic, exotic enough to suggest mystery, French enough to imply sophistication. Lili St. sounded like a woman with a past, with secrets, with the kind of dangerous glamour that made people lean forward. Marie Van Schaack sounded like someone's future wife. Lili St. sounded like someone's future regret. She started in burlesque almost by accident. A dancer got sick, the club needed someone who could move, and Lili had always been fearless about her body. But she approached it differently than the other girls. They stripped mechanically, following routines designed to excite men as quickly and cheaply as possible. Lili saw something else: theater. She studied classical theater, watched how great actresses used timing and suggestion, how they made audiences work for revelation. Her first solo act was simple. She danced as if alone, as if the audience were voyeurs glimpsing something private rather than consumers buying a product. She took her time. She made every gesture deliberate, turned the removal of each garment into a statement rather than surrender. The audience didn't know what to do. This wasn't the frantic energy they expected. This was something slower, more hypnotic, almost meditative. It worked. Word spread. The girl who danced like she was performing art instead of anatomy, who made you feel like an intruder even as you paid to watch. Club owners started bidding for her. She raised her prices. By 1941, at 23, she was making more than most male performers, headlining shows across Montreal and into New York. She made rebellion profitable by making desire respectable. The 1940s were Lili's laboratory years. She experimented with everything: lighting, music, narrative, costume. She studied striptease like an academic pursuit, reading about Salome and the dance of the seven veils, about Japanese no theater where suggestion mattered more than revelation, about the power dynamics of looking and being looked at. She transformed burlesque from cheap thrill into considered performance. Her signature acts from this period became legendary. The trapeze act, where she swung above the audience in progressively less clothing, always just out of reach, literalizing the unattainability that made desire work. The mirror dance, where she performed in front of floor-length mirrors, so the audience saw her watching herself, understood that their gaze was secondary to hers. Each act was a thesis statement. I control what you see. I decide what has value. Your desire belongs to you, but my body belongs to me. Critics didn't know what to make of her. Some called it art, some called it pornography. Most didn't have vocabulary for something that was clearly both and neither. She was too intelligent to be dismissed as mere exhibitionism, too sexual to be claimed by respectable theater. She existed in the gap, and she liked it there. Spaces between categories were where power lived for women who refused standard scripts. But the act that made her famous and infamous was deceptively simple. 1949, Las Vegas, the El Rancho. The bathtub act. Lili performed her entire routine in a real bathtub filled with soapy water, using the props of domestic femininity, soap, sponge, towel, as instruments of seduction. She bathed on stage the way a woman might bathe alone, slowly, sensually, existing in her own pleasure. The audience didn't feel like they were watching a strip show. They felt like they were watching something private, intimate, almost transgressive in its reality. The police thought so too. They raided the show, arrested her for public indecency. The trial became a media circus. Prosecutors argued she'd committed an obscene act. Lili's defense was elegant in its simplicity. I'm a dancer. If men see sin in it, that's their eyes, not my art. She won. The judge, possibly understanding that prosecuting a woman for bathing was ridiculous optics, ruled that artistic expression couldn't be criminalized just because it involved nudity. It was precedent, ammunition for every burlesque performer after her. But more than that, it was validation. What she did wasn't just entertainment. It was art that made people uncomfortable because it challenged their assumptions about female sexuality, about who got to control the narrative of desire. Behind the glamour everyone photographed, was there a loneliness nobody saw? Yes. Despite the fame, the sold-out shows, the men who threw themselves at her with proposals and promises, Lili was fundamentally alone in her work. Burlesque dancers weren't taken seriously, weren't invited to respectable parties, weren't considered real artists by the establishment. She existed in a cultural purgatory, too famous to ignore, too scandalous to embrace. She married 6 times. Each marriage was a kind of experiment, testing whether partnership was possible for someone whose whole career was about autonomy, whether love could exist alongside the persona she'd created. They all failed, not dramatically. Lili didn't do drama off stage, but quietly, inevitably. She'd say later, "Men wanted to own me, women wanted to understand me, neither could." The truth was simpler and sadder. She'd built an identity around not being owned, and marriage required surrender she couldn't perform. Her husbands thought they were marrying Marie, the girl underneath. But there was no underneath anymore. Lili wasn't disguise, she was transformation. The person who'd existed before burlesque had been replaced by someone who understood power too well to give it away, even for love. Her relationships with other performers were easier. Gypsy Rose Lee, the other great name in burlesque, became both rival and confidant. They understood each other's isolation, the particular loneliness of being famous for something respectable society considered shameful. They'd call each other the saint and the sinner of burlesque, though neither could agree on who was which. The friendship had an edge. Competition was inevitable when you're both trying to be the best at something the world thinks is worthless. But it was real. Sometimes the only people who understand you are the ones doing the same impossible work. Marilyn Monroe came to see her show once, early in Monroe's career when she was still Norma Jean trying to figure out how to be somebody. After the performance, Monroe came backstage, starstruck in a way that surprised Lili. "Someday I want to make them feel like you do," Monroe said. Lili looked at her, so young, so hungry, so doomed, and wanted to warn her. Being desired doesn't protect you. It just makes people think they own you. But Monroe wouldn't have understood yet. She had to learn it herself the hard way. When trust becomes performance, how do you know what's real? You don't. That was Lili's secret and her curse. She'd performed for so long, been Lili St so completely, that Marie Van Schaack had become a character she barely remembered playing. Off stage, she was still performing. The glamorous recluse, the intelligent sex symbol, the woman who read Oscar Wilde and collected French lingerie. It was all true and all performance simultaneously. The boundary had dissolved. She'd sit alone in her dressing room before shows, applying makeup in the mirror, and sometimes catch herself wondering, who is this? The face looking back was beautiful, expertly constructed, absolutely in control. But was it her? Or had she become her own best creation? Did the distinction matter anymore? Friends from her Minnesota past wouldn't have recognized her. Not just physically, though she'd transformed from plain pretty girl to goddess, but essentially. Lili St had opinions, demanded respect, controlled rooms. Marie Van Schaack had been quiet, uncertain, eager to please. The metamorphosis was complete, irreversible. She couldn't go back even if she wanted to. There was no back, only forward, only Lili, only this. The loneliness came from succeeding too well at her own invention. She'd wanted to be someone who couldn't be owned, and she'd achieved it so thoroughly that no one could reach her. She existed behind glass, visible, desirable, fundamentally untouchable. The bathtub act wasn't metaphor. It was literal truth. She existed in her own element, separated from the audience by something invisible but absolute. She didn't die from the performance. She died proving performance can be freedom. The 1950s were her peak years. She commanded fees higher than most legitimate actresses, headlined Las Vegas when Vegas was the center of American entertainment, appeared in films, though Hollywood never knew what to do with her, how to capture what made her compelling within the constraints of the production code. Son of Sinbad in 1955 gave her a role, but it was sanitized, defanged, nothing like the raw power of her stage work. She didn't mind. Film was never her medium anyway. Film captured images, but burlesque was about presence, the exchange of energy between performer and audience, The risk of live performance, the irreproducibility of each show. Every night was different because she was different, because the audience was different, because the alchemy of theater requires all elements to be present and volatile. But by the late 1950s, burlesque was dying. Television made home entertainment easy, strip clubs made burlesque look tame, and the sexual revolution that should have vindicated her instead made her seem quaint. Young women didn't need to watch Lili St to understand their own power. They could sleep with whomever they wanted, wear whatever they chose, be as sexual as they pleased. The battle Lili had fought through performance was being fought now in bedrooms and consciousness-raising groups and protest marches. She was only in her 40s, but she felt ancient. The world had caught up to her, then passed her by. What had been radical, a woman controlling her own sexuality, using desire as power, was now almost expected. Her specific form of rebellion had been made obsolete by broader revolution. She retired in the early 1960s. Not with fanfare. Lili was too smart for nostalgia tours and comeback attempts. She simply stopped performing, opened a lingerie boutique in Los Angeles called Chez Lili, and disappeared into the privacy she'd never had during her famous years. She stopped posing for light and started selling it. But light doesn't forget its source. Her final decades were quiet. The boutique did well. Women came for the French lace and stayed for the woman behind the counter. Though Lili discouraged reminiscence. She wasn't interested in being treated like an artifact. Didn't want to spend her remaining years answering the same questions about the same famous acts. She'd lived that life. Now she was living a different one. She read voraciously. Philosophy, history, novels that engaged ideas rather than just telling stories. She'd call burlesque her college degree in human nature, and she'd spent decades after earning a doctorate through observation. She understood power, performance, the economics of desire, the way societies used women's bodies as battlegrounds for larger anxieties about morality and control. She could have written brilliant cultural criticism if anyone had taken her seriously enough to ask. Instead, she wrote in journals, letters to the few friends she'd maintained, reflections that were sharp and self-aware and occasionally bitter. "I was born in the wrong century," she wrote in 1985. "This one still fears its own desire." She meant it both ways. The century feared desire and feared her for embodying it without shame, for making it beautiful and dangerous in hers. Every night before bed, she performed a private ritual. She'd stand before her full-length mirror, the same kind she'd used on stage, and slowly remove her clothing, not sensuously but methodically, studying her aging body with the same attention she'd given it when it was her fortune. The ritual was partly vanity, partly meditation, partly defiance against the idea that beauty had to be youthful to matter. She was beautiful still, just differently. The skin had loosened, the curves had softened, but the bone structure remained, the carriage, the understanding of how to hold space. She looked like a dowager empress reviewing her empire, satisfied with what she'd built even as it crumbled. They called it a career. She called it revolution, conducted one performance at a time. January 29th, 1999. Los Angeles. Lili St. died at 80 years old in her apartment, surrounded by silk and mirrors and all the beautiful things she'd collected when she could finally afford to. The death was quiet, unremarkable. Heart failure, age, the body finally claiming its right to rest. She'd lived twice as long as anyone expected for someone who'd burned that brightly, who'd transgressed that publicly. The obituaries were respectful but distant. Former burlesque star dies at 80. They summarized her career, mentioned the famous acts, noted her arrests and trials, treated her like a colorful footnote in entertainment history. Few recognized what she'd actually been, a feminist before feminism had language for itself, an artist who'd used the only canvas available to her, her own body, to make statements about autonomy and power that the culture wasn't ready to hear. but some understood. Dita Von Teese, who'd revive burlesque in the next century, said, "Everything I do is a thank you note to Lili." Other performers, scholars studying the history of female performance, feminists investigating body politics, they recognized Lili as pioneer, as martyr, as the woman who'd insisted that sexual power didn't have to mean sexual submission, that you could be desirable and in control simultaneously. Her will requested her ashes be scattered on a stage in Montreal, the first place she'd been applauded, the first place she'd understood that her body could be more than what others projected onto it. The theater was gone by then, demolished for condominiums. They scattered her ashes in the empty lot where it had stood on concrete that had once held spotlights and sawdust and the sounds of men losing their minds over a woman who never lost hers. Her heart didn't fail. It simply finished its performance. After her death, they found her apartment exactly as you'd imagine. Mirrors everywhere, vintage photographs of her glory days, wardrobes full of silk and lace and the costumes she'd designed for acts that redefined what performance could be. On her vanity, a note written in lipstick on the mirror, "Own the room or it owns you." They also found journals, decades of them filled with her elegant handwriting, observations about art and power and the particular isolation of being desired but not known. One entry from 1961 read, "Men wanted to own me. Women wanted to understand me. Neither could. But I owned myself completely, and that was worth the loneliness." Another from 1952. "I never showed everything. Mystery pays better than nudity." It was her aesthetic philosophy, her economic strategy, her theory of power. Don't give them everything, they'll value you less. Make them work for each revelation. Maintain something forever out of reach. The most revealing entry came from near the end, undated but clearly written in her final years. "Never be ashamed of who you make people remember." It was both pride and resignation. She'd made herself unforgettable by being unrepentantly sexual, unapologetically powerful, absolutely refusing to apologize for understanding that desire could be art when you controlled it, shame when you didn't. Did her defiance mark her as radical, or reveal how conservative the culture remained? Both. Lili was radical in refusing shame, in claiming her sexuality as something that belonged to her rather than being something others could access without permission. But the fact that this was radical, that simply owning your own body and using it as you chose was transgressive, revealed how deeply conservative the culture was about female autonomy. She'd been arrested multiple times for obscenity, but what was obscene? She bathed on stage, danced in progressively less clothing, existed visibly as a sexual being. Men did far more explicit things in private and weren't criminalized. The law wasn't protecting public morality. It was punishing female autonomy, the suggestion that women could be sexual for themselves rather than for men. Every trial she won was a small crack in that system. Not enough to break it. The system was too strong, too embedded in centuries of controlling women's bodies. But cracks nonetheless. Precedents that said you couldn't arrest a woman just for being beautiful and unashamed. That artistry mattered, that context and intention could transform what looked like obscenity into something else. Her legacy wasn't immediate recognition. That would take decades. It was the slow accumulation of women who saw what she'd done and understood. You don't need permission to inhabit your own body, to use your own power, to refuse the stories others try to write on your skin. Addiction taught her what fame never could. Control the narrative or it controls you. Lili had never been addicted to substances. She was too careful, too aware that control was her currency and drugs would cost her that. But she'd been addicted to something else. The performance, the power, the nightly proof that she could make hundreds of people hold their breath just by moving slowly. That addiction was harder to quit than any chemical. When she stopped performing, she had to learn who she was without the validation of applause, without the nightly ritual of transformation from person to goddess. It was disorienting, like losing a language she'd spoken fluently for decades. She wasn't Marie anymore, that girl was long gone, but without audiences, without stages, who was Lili? The answer took years to find. She was whoever she decided to be, moment by moment, without requiring external validation. The boutique was one answer. The reading and writing were others. The private mirror rituals were a third, continuing the performance but for an audience of one, the only audience that ultimately mattered. She learned what she'd been teaching all along without quite understanding it herself. That the performance was never for them. It was always for her. They just paid to watch her become more herself, more powerful, more free. And if you could do that without them, if you could perform autonomy in an empty room, then you'd finally arrived at something like truth. Can anyone ever truly own the image they create? No. And Lili understood this earlier than most. The moment you become famous, the moment your image enters public consciousness, it stops belonging entirely to you. People project their desires, their fears, their fantasies onto it. Lili St, the person, was finite, contained, knowable if you bothered. Lili St, the image was infinite, mutating, whatever each viewer needed her to be. She'd created the image deliberately, controlled it as much as anyone could. But control was always partial, always negotiated. Men thought she existed for their pleasure and got angry when confronted with evidence otherwise. Women thought she was either victim or traitor to her sex, couldn't conceive that she might be neither. Moralists thought she was corrupter of youth. Artists thought she was genius. She was all of it and none of it simultaneously. The image outlived her. Photos of her performances circulate still, the bathtub act, the mirror dance, shots of her face at perfect angles with perfect lighting. They're beautiful and hollow, capturing what she looked like but not what she was. A woman using the only tools available to her, beauty, sexuality, intelligence, to carve out space for herself in a world that wanted to reduce her to object. In her final journal entry, weeks before she died, she wrote, "I wasn't trying to shock the world. I was trying to wake it up." To what? To the possibility that women could be sexual beings without being available. That desire didn't require submission, that you could strip down to nothing and still be wearing armor if you understood power correctly. Were these final years acts of retreat or victory in different register? Victory. Lili had never wanted endless fame. She'd wanted freedom, and fame was tool toward that end. When she'd earned enough money and proved her point sufficiently, she took the freedom and left the fame behind. That was the smart play, the move people who actually win make rather than people who just want to be seen winning. Her quiet decades in Los Angeles weren't surrender. They were the life she'd earned, chosen, designed according to her own specifications rather than the culture's demands. She read what she wanted, saw who she wanted, spoke or didn't speak as she chose. She'd spent her performing years teaching people that she wasn't available for possession. Her retirement years embodied that lesson. She made herself unavailable entirely except on terms she dictated. The boutique was genius, continuing to work in her medium, feminine aesthetics, sexual power, beautiful things, but from a position of complete control. No audiences to please, no critics to answer to, no arrests for obscenity. Just transactions between adults about what made them feel powerful and beautiful. And if customers wanted to hear stories from her famous years, well, that was her choice to share or withhold, performed on her schedule. For compensation, she determined. She'd won everything she'd fought for. Autonomy, financial security, the right to control her own narrative even as the culture tried to write different stories about her. Most people who burn that bright burn out young. Lili burned bright and kept burning for 80 years, just lowered the flame when it suited her. Her absence became its own kind of presence, one you feel before you see. After Lili died, burlesque went through its own death and resurrection. By the early 2000s, it was being revived by new performers who understood what Lili had known. That striptease could be art if you approached it with intelligence. That female sexuality didn't have to be packaged for male consumption. That power and beauty and intelligence could coexist in a single performance. Dita Von Teese was most direct about the debt. She studied Lili's acts, recreated some of them, built her own career on the foundation Lili had laid. But where Lili had fought for recognition that what she did was art, Dita inherited a world that, sometimes conditionally, agreed. The revolution Lili started had been won, or at least advanced far enough that burlesque could be discussed in respectable venues, written about seriously, treated as legitimate performance rather than mere titillation. Other performers followed, each finding their own way to embody what Lili had discovered. That controlling the narrative of your own desire was a kind of power, that making people work for each revelation gave you leverage, that you could be object of desire and subject of your own story simultaneously, if you were smart enough and tough enough and certain enough. But the culture that claimed to celebrate them still didn't fully understand what Lili had been doing. They thought it was about sex. It was about control. They thought it was about pleasing men. It was about pleasing herself and letting men watch. They thought it was about the body. It was about who got to decide what the body meant. Maybe that's what legacy is. The thing you prove that others spend decades trying to understand. Lili's photographs circulate online now, found by people who never saw her perform, shared with captions about vintage glamour and old Hollywood. They're beautiful images, carefully composed, but they miss what made her extraordinary. The live presence, the intelligence behind the performance, the way she could make you forget you were watching and feel instead like you were witnessing something private, almost sacred. The bathtub photograph is most famous. Her in the tub, water and bubbles strategically placed, her expression serene and slightly amused. It's been reproduced thousands of times, used in documentaries and articles and retrospectives. But the image can't capture what the performance did. The tension between public and private, the subversion of domestic ritual, the way she made something utterly mundane, bathing, into something charged and dangerous simply by doing it with awareness and intention. Her costumes are in museums now, displayed behind glass with little placards explaining their historical significance. They look fragile, antique, like artifacts from a vanished civilization. Which is accurate. The world Lili inhabited is gone. The specific battles she fought have been won or rendered irrelevant by different battles. But the costumes remain beautiful and slightly sad, like armor after the war has ended and no one remembers what was being defended. She left no children, no direct heirs to claim her legacy. What she left instead was a model, a proof of concept, that women could control their own image and profit from it, that sexual power didn't require sexual availability, that you could transgress every rule of respectability and die rich and free and unrepentant. That was the inheritance she gave to every woman who came after. Not money or property, but possibility. It was, and that was enough. In the end, maybe Lili's life proves that the personal can be political even when you never use those words, that choosing yourself over others' expectations is revolutionary even when you just call it common sense, that the body is always a battleground but you get to decide whose flag flies over it. She wasn't perfect, no one that armored ever is. The 6 marriages suggest someone unable to be vulnerable enough for intimacy. The isolation suggests someone who'd built walls so high no one could scale them. The performance suggests someone who'd learned to disappear into image because being person was too dangerous or too painful or both. But she was free in a way most people never achieve. Free from shame, from apology, from the requirement to make herself smaller or quieter or more palatable. She lived exactly as she chose, paid every price that living required, and died having built exactly the life she wanted from materials everyone else thought were insufficient. Before every show, she'd write on her mirror in lipstick, Own the room or it owns you. It was instructions, warning, prayer. She owned every room she entered for 60 years, and when she tired of rooms, she went home and owned that too. Complete ownership of self, isn't that what freedom is? Not doing whatever you want, but knowing absolutely who you are and refusing to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort. The mirror in her apartment, they say, still has faint traces of lipstick writing. Layers upon layers of the same phrase written night after night, year after year, until it soaked into the glass itself. Museums wanted it. Collectors bid for it. Her estate sold it to a burlesque revival theater in Montreal, where it hangs backstage for contemporary performers to see before they step into spotlights. The message is clear. Lili might be gone, but the instruction remains. Own yourself. Own your power. Own every room or they'll own you. It's the inheritance she left, written in a color called Victory Red, in handwriting that never wavered, on a surface that reflects back whoever has courage enough to look. When desire becomes art, who owns the pleasure, the viewer or the viewed? And if a woman strips away everything except certainty, what does she reveal? Lili St. answered both questions the same way. Herself. Always herself. The viewer owned their response, their desire, their discomfort. That was theirs to manage. What she revealed when everything else fell away was the irreducible fact of her own autonomy. The self that existed independent of their gaze, powerful not because they wanted her, but because she wanted herself exactly as she was. She proved it with her life, even when her death tried to argue otherwise. The culture wanted to reduce her to cautionary tale or nostalgic footnote, but the truth was simpler and more revolutionary. She'd been free in an unfree world, powerful in a system designed to render her powerless, herself completely when everyone else demanded she be who they needed. That's not tragedy. That's triumph in velvet and mirror light, performed one night at a time until the final curtain. And the final curtain, when it came, wasn't defeat. It was rest after work completed, the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd performed every role they'd meant to, and could finally step out of the spotlight knowing they'd owned it completely. The water was always warm, the lights always perfect, and she was always entirely, irreducibly, magnificently herself.